Hey everybody, today in our video we're going to go through a topic that is hotly debated when it comes to health, and it has to do with vaccines. You see, we've done some video interviews with some medical doctors that have alluded to rushing a vaccine and what that can mean for health reasons. So what I decided to do was interview an investigative journalist, look at the past and the current situation of what it is that we have going on with vaccinations, in particular with this COVID crisis. What you're gonna find in this 40-minute interview is mind-blowing. It will absolutely shake some of your paradigms and hopefully put you on a healthier path, because that's what this YouTube channel is all about. Making informed consent, healthy decisions naturally. And if you like these videos that drop on a weekly basis, hit the subscribe button right here. And even better, click this little bell over here. That way when the videos drop, you'll get this notification and you won't miss this. Today's a special treat because I'm gonna interview an author who wrote the book Pharma. Now his background is he's an investigative journalist, so there's over 300 pages of references and resources on this topic. We're gonna share some things on some of the vaccination history, and as he says, is past going to be prologue? In other words, how they have operated in the past is a pretty dicey history. And we want to know, with this rushed agenda with vaccines coming out for COVID, if it's going to be more the same or if we can expect safety with speed. You're going to love what he says, and I hope you are ready to enjoy a phenomenal interview because it's a bit lengthy, but man, is he good. Hey, the Wellness Champions are all about keeping you healthy naturally. The science speaks. We have research articles, journal articles to back up all of this information. It has been substantiated, so therefore you can sit back and trust this information as something that will give you a guideline and hopefully spur some questions towards a healthier lifestyle. I'm not telling you what to do, but I do want to raise some questions that could put you on a better path. Like I said, it's hotly debated, but this will give you a lot of insight into things that often aren't in the media. For that reason, we love YouTube. Hey everybody, I am excited because we've got the author of this amazing book, Pharma, with us today. And Gerald Posner is going to share some insight on what's been a really controversial topic, a very hot topic. But as he and I have discussed off camera, I think quite often the past can be an indicator of where we're going in the future, or as Gerald said, past is prologue. So on this very controversial topic, I appreciate you as the author of the book Pharma taking some time to really dive into the history of vaccines. So first of all, thank you for coming to the call and appreciate your time, buddy.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Doc. I really appreciate it. Great to be back with you. You're absolutely right. I think that if you understand the history of vaccines in the pharmaceutical industry, I do this history of the American pharma business, and vaccines is part of that business, no question about it. If you see what they've done in the past, you're going to get a pretty good idea of what they're going to be doing with COVID. And it's not always a great picture. Go back to the 1950s, which was sort of their golden era. Polio vaccines, which they came out with. The first polio vaccine, which is a dead vaccine, but it's a shot. That comes when they come up with that, they produce it from 4 pharmaceutical firms, and they mix it with some live vaccine at one point. Cutter does. That's the company. And when they ship it out, 45,000 children fall sick in 10 different states. Some end up with polio and a few end up dying. So everybody forgets about that in the polio rollout for vaccines the first time around. Then they decide that vaccine's not so great. It has no patent on it. Nobody owns that vaccine. So they go to a different vaccine, by the way, by Albert Sabin. That vaccine does have the patent on it. Companies are making money all the way across the board. It happens to be a live vaccine. Now they've already inoculated 90 million people in the US with the dead vaccine from Jonas Salk. They don't want to try then to put it out here because they may not be able to get real results. Where do they go? They go down to Africa. They go down to the Belgian Congo, where they tested in 1958 and 1959 on 1 million people there to see if it's safe. And then they say, oh, it's safe enough to bring back to the US. And that becomes the rollout, even though they know at that time that because it's a live vaccine, that for every 1 million doses they give, they're going to get 1, 2, or 3 cases of polio at the very least. People are immunocompromised, a little suppression in their immune system. They happen to just fit into the vaccine the wrong way. That's the risk they took, and they went ahead and did it. So they caused polio in a very small number of cases. They gave that vaccine out to hundreds of millions of people. A lot of money was made, and they tested on 1 million people in Africa with no informed consent. So that's the first story, the first time we ever get it on polio.
So that's huge. First of all, testing it, in Africa on children, and also no informed consent, meaning they did these shots, these vaccines, and whatever they told them it was for, they really had no idea what was going on. And then as the outcomes come, children, as a result, got polio from the shot. And whatever they deemed to be okay as collateral damage, whatever the pharmaceutical company, decided was okay in the number of people hurt, they then decided to bring that back to the States. Is that right?
Yes, and what's interesting is of the million people tested, we know this from the records that were still found in the Belgian Congo, 73,000 children under the age of 5 were among those tested. But when you say, Doc, without informed consent, let me tell you something. This isn't just uninformed consent to vaccines in the Belgian Congo. We had a 40-year history here in the U.S. As you know, in the Tuskegee experiments, the United States Public Health Service was administering to healthy Black men. They were injecting them essentially with syphilis to find out how they might be able to treat it for a 40-year period until that came out. I talk about in the book Sloan Kettering, one of the greatest names in cancer treatment in the United States. There were doctors there in the early 1960s who were injecting live cancer cells into patients to see how they would respond as to their immune system built around with the tumors. Now, the people were signing waivers, but they didn't know it included live cancer cells. When that broke, it was a major scandal. But what happened? The doctor got suspended who was running them. And a year later, in 1964, when he was off his suspension, he became president of the American Cancer Society. So, uninformed consent runs through the history of the pharmaceutical business. Even when they roll out mild tranquilizers like Valium and Librium, where are they testing them? As I disclosed, they're testing them on prison patients. They're putting it on prison patients. They're getting successful results. And then the prison system are buying the mild tranquilizers to give to the patients. So it goes beyond vaccines. Uninformed consent on human trials, we see them here as well.
Now, is that common that they would do that in third world countries in addition to the U.S.?
No question about it in third world countries. That's a matter of fact, there's something that I talk about in the later chapters, and that is that in 2017, that's the last time the study was really done, 90% of all the human clinical trials done for drugs approved by the FDA in the United States are done on people outside of the United States. So think about that for a moment. Wow. We've got all these drugs being approved. 90% of the human trials, where are they done? Not here. They're done abroad. And there's a reason for that. It's easy. It's easier to get the consent sometimes. Occasionally, you'll get a government in an African or Asian country that's willing to work with you because you're also making contributions to their public health service or sector, and it's going to other things. So they'll provide willing, candidates for the trials. But I think that that's rather remarkable that we aren't testing here on our own people anymore. We're testing abroad because we find it easier and less legal liability.
And are drugs more profitable in the U.S. compared to what the sale price is other places in the world?
Oh, drug companies could not make the profits they make if they didn't have the United States. So while we may be only one of 2 countries in the world, the other being New Zealand, who are crazy enough to allow pharma companies to advertise directly to consumers, us, the patient, we are the only country in the world that allows them to set whatever price they want, no matter what. So what happens is, you can figure this out, this doesn't take, if you're in a small business and you go to sell your product, and you want to sell your product in San Francisco, and the San Francisco City Council says, we're only going to pay you $10 a unit for your product, whatever it is, and you'd really like to be making 20, and you come to sell it in Santa Barbara, and Santa Barbara says, by the way, there's no limit on how much you can charge for this product. You'll charge 45 in Santa Barbara. And between the two, you'll earn the money you want. So what happens on drugs, the pharmaceutical companies are told by England, France, Germany, and other places, no, we won't pay that price you're asking. They negotiate a price that they consider fair. And then the pharma companies come here and they set the higher price. And I'm not just saying this. How do I know this? Because in 2018, there was a study done across the board of drugs in the United States that had the same drug in another country. We were on average 3 times more expensive than Europe and 16 times more expensive than the poorest country in India. And this isn't just for the last few years. Look I write about this in Milltown, which is the big mild tranquilizer that came out in the 50s. It was 400% more expensive in the United States than it was anywhere else. OxyContin, which is the poster child for the opioid crisis, is 450 to 500% more expensive in the United States than it is outside. EpiPens, we know the story, $600 here, $100. So time and time again, the very same drug here, multiples more expensive. And it's not, and this is key. I show this repeatedly. They say, meaning they, the drug companies, this is for research and development. If we don't get this money here in the United States, it won't pay for the research and development for these great drugs we're rolling out around the world. That's false. Right. It doesn't pay for the $50 million salaries for the CEO. It doesn't pay for the stock buybacks. It doesn't pay for the promotion and the advertising, all of which adds up to much more than what they're spending in the lab.
Right. So tremendously more expensive, not to mention the prices are higher here in the US, but also we take majority of the drugs that are manufactured. We take, the largest percentage of pharmaceutical drugs are consumed here in the US, and they're charging more for it. So it's crazy that these tests are being done on people sometimes without their consent. If I'm not mistaken, I think the Tuskegee, what they call the Tuskegee experiment, was actually causing sterility in predominantly African-American males. So that was one of the outcomes, and they didn't even know what was in the shot, right? So they lied to them, and sterility was the outcome. What are some other vaccines that were administered that you would say is a bit of a train wreck or cause more harm than good?
Well, I have an entire chapter about the swine flu fiasco, and people may not remember that. Some of your listeners may. 1976, Gerald Ford was president. There was a case of swine flu in Fort Dix, in an army barrack, and that made everybody in the government petrified that they were going to get a repeat of the 1918 swine flu epidemic, the Spanish flu. Mm-hmm. Which we certainly heard a lot about recently. And so they started to gear up for a massive vaccination inoculation program without numbers of cases spreading, believe it or not. And they spent $135 million. They picked 4 pharmaceutical companies to get the vaccines ready. Those pharmaceutical companies were in heaven. They geared up for it. They manufactured it. We're talking Merck, Pfizer, big companies. And then the government went to them and said, okay, we need the vaccines. We're going to do the inoculation. And the company said, nope, not so fast. They held the $100 million back in a public health crisis to say we want 2 things. We want our reasonable cost to be covered. There's a big difference between what I consider reasonable and what they consider reasonable. And we want to be covered for any lawsuits for any liability at all. Government gave them both of that. Those companies walked away with tens of millions of dollars in profit. We in the United States gave out 40 million shots before we realized there was no swine flu pandemic. And what was the result? Something called Guillain-Barré, a neurological disorder that's very rare, that was a side effect of this shot that nobody had taken into account and didn't realize it was. And as those cases multiplied, the federal government ended up with 4,000 lawsuits of people's lives who had been turned upside down. So you look back just to 76, swine flu, it's a fiasco.
So is that a turning point then in 1976 when these vaccine makers pulled back the vaccines and basically had leverage on the US government, who funded the research on this, right? So the US government funds it, the pharmaceutical companies make it, and then they withhold the vaccines and they say, now we want total immunity if there's lawsuits. Is that a turning point for Big Pharma when it comes to vaccines?
So this is what's so fantastic about knowing the playbook for Big Pharma. So what I give you in this book is their playbook, and their playbook doesn't change because they get away with it time and again, and nobody's come in and said, by the way, we're instituting new rules to make it fair. So you would think that the public was so enraged, the government was so enraged. Jimmy Carter, who became the next president, would say, never going to happen again. I'm going to institute rules in the FDA and in HHS. You'll never be able to pull that fast one again. And guess what? Bring ourselves all the way up to 2020 and COVID-19. $8.3 billion is the first funding that comes out of the federal government that's running out to COVID. $3 billion of that is straight research money given to the drug companies like a giveaway. And what do? In the first draft of the bill for that $8.3 billion, there are 2 provisions in there, one of which would allow the government to have a real hammer to come in if the drug price on the vaccine was too high and be able to push that price down. The second one was to say, you guys meaning the drug companies, aren't going to own the intellectual property rights to the research. We will, and we'll make it public for everyone. Both of those clauses were taken out in the final draft of the $8.3 billion. Why? Because the pharmaceutical companies know what they want to do. If they wait until the end, when the vaccine is nearly ready and the public is anxious and they've been cooped up for a long time and they've been self-isolating and everybody is ready for the vaccine to be the answer to end COVID, they are in the ultimate position of leverage, just as they were in 76 when the Ford administration said, give us the doses now. And they said, no, hold up. We've got 2 things. They got those 2 things given in rapid time. And here, if we don't keep our eye on the ball, we will get to the stage where we have a vaccine from one of these companies or a consortium of them, and they will be in the position to dictate the terms on price and on liability.
Which would mean price traditionally is at least 3 times higher than what they would charge anywhere else in the world. And the thing is, when you compare those statistics to Europe, that's a relative economy as far as dollar for dollar or dollar to euro. You know, if you look at the UK, depending on the time, you know, it could be a little higher ratio for the UK to the dollar. So these aren't like third world countries. What I'm getting at is, you know, it's pretty much on par, but here we are paying 3 times the amount. But the thing that gets me, and this is the turning point in the 70s, is that they're absolved of any lawsuits. So if I got the numbers right, you said they administered something like 40,000 inoculations, and they had 4,000 lawsuits. That would be 10%.
So 40 million. They 40 million.
Okay.
They had 4,000 lawsuits, but the lawsuits, remember, aren't indicative of all the injuries. So
right. Yeah.
Everybody who gets injured or has a mild case or that will automatically follow suit. The number of suits I always think are amplified by the number of people who are really injured behind that.
Yeah.
And there's another thing which is interesting is, remember what they were asking for here. They were saying to the government, okay, we want to be absolved of any liability if there are any side effects from this vaccine that we're not aware of. We've done the testing and everything else, and you're happy with it, we're happy with it. That might be one thing, but the government absolved them of any liability for their own negligence and incompetence in manufacturing it. And this isn't just a theoretical thing. And this is why it's important. Jonas Salk's first vaccine for polio was a dead virus. So you think, okay, it's going to be hard for people to really get polio because it's not an attenuated virus. However, what happens with that? Qatar, one of the labs making it, leaves it as a live virus in the batch that goes out. So the batch that hurts people, that leaves tens of thousands actually sick in those 10 Western states, is because the pharmaceutical company manufacturing it doesn't follow the guidelines. It's its error that forces it. Under the 1976 swine flu coverage, they wouldn't be responsible. Even if they put rat poison into the vaccine, killing people, they wouldn't be responsible. So if a future US government, whether it's a Trump administration or a Democratic or Republican administration coming in later, says to these drug companies, you're absolved of any responsibility for these vaccines that you manufacture, because one will discover it and others are going to have the manufacturing capacity for it, we would be insane to do that.
So again, kind of where we started with this, past is prologue, meaning the tax dollars are expediting these trials. The US taxpayers are paying for this vaccine to be pushed through. If there's any negative side once they administer it, which there always is, then the government will cover that, and then the profits are going to go to the drug companies. Do I have that about right?
Yeah, you have it exactly right. And as a matter of fact, one of the things interesting is the average patient in the US, in England, in Italy, wherever, they aren't going to feel the difference on the prices. So you're not going to have an Italian lawyer in Rome say, by the way, I just paid $10 for my COVID vaccine that was given to me by GlaxoSmithKline, and someone in America will say, I paid $30 in New York City, I'm paying 3 times the amount. Because remember, the governments are going to buy these vaccines. They're going to be the ones paying the prices across the board. People will get them distributed free because what the government's going to do is use the big mallet to say, we need to have national inoculations. That means you've got to line up and start to take the shots or to get the sugar cubes and be able to swallow them if it's an oral administration. And to do that, they have to make sure it doesn't take a penny out of anybody's pocket. It will take money out of our pocket because we, the taxpayers, will end up paying the amount that's going to the drug companies. But that's where it comes in. The drug companies will be charging the governments as much as they can. The government's going to pass them on to us as free.
Right. And then if there's a side effect with it or there's collateral damage, there's no way to go after the drug maker. So they're scot-free. And then we bring it up to full speed in 2020. This COVID crisis is perfect for profits because taxpayers are paying for it to be expedited. So what I see right now is for the first time ever, they are making the vaccine without the test. So while they're simultaneously speeding up the vaccine production, they're starting the testing to see if it's safe. And my guess is by the time they get to the end of the testing, because they'll have all these batches made, they're probably going to decide they're safe enough, right? And it's like safe enough, fair enough. Is it, is the damage minimal enough? And I look at that and I go, I think we see what's coming. And I want to do this interview justice because you're an investigative journalist and you've seen this time and again. Speculative questions are popping up all the time around Bill Gates and his, excitement for vaccines and inoculations. And I want to be really clear for the listeners here. Those are the appropriate words: vaccines, inoculations. Oftentimes drug companies like to confuse the consumer, like to confuse people on television, and they'll call them immunizations, which would imply you're immune. They're not immunizations, they're vaccinations, they're inoculations. There are side effects that go with them, but hey, the drug companies are protected because the government's already made that deal in the 70s. And so now we're expediting, we're pushing safety over speed. Do I have that about right?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I know this much on Bill Gates. Everything else aside, let's assume for a second that he's absolutely sincere in his advocacy for vaccines. So he's a true believer. He's had the Kool-Aid. He believes it 100%.
He owns the Kool-Aid, by the way.
Yeah, he owns the Kool-Aid. But what's interesting is that as a result of that, he is the greatest thing that's happened to the pharmaceutical industry. Because just a few days ago, he was saying that he's willing to spend some of his own billions to actually create the manufacturing plants that might be required to make the vaccine for COVID. Now, we're talking about a new level. So we're not just talking about public research money being used for all of the research, billions of dollars flooding into the pharmaceutical companies, more money than they've had at any other time. But now we're talking about Bill Gates providing billions of dollars of free money to them to build the manufacturing plants that they don't have the capacity for, so they can turn it out at record numbers. This is the perfect storm, if you want to look at it that way. So that much I do know, that from the pharma perspective, if you're sitting on a board right now of a company like Moderna or Glaxo or J&J, you're chasing a vaccine, this is about as good as it gets for you.
That's right. So record production in terms of bulk quantity, record speed, minimal research, minimal science. And typically I've been interviewing medical doctors that specifically, specialize in vaccines, and they said, look, 3 to 4 years would be a minimum. They're trying to get this thing out in 6 months. And again, it's not a left or a right thing. It's not a Republican or a Democrat. This is the history of big pharma on this particular topic, which is hotly controversial. And I don't know why, because the past is prologue. And if you look at what they've done and what the rules of engagement are, they're exempt from anything that could go on, and it falls back to the government, who's funding, and now private funding from Bill Gates. To me, I think he's made a lot of his, overtures really obvious and what his agenda is. And this is, again, speculative, but when the United States pulls out the funding from the World Health Organization, and the number 2 funder of the World Health Organization is Bill Gates himself, I personally am not shocked to see him now personally funding the manufacturing of the vaccines. He's got an agenda, and I'm going to say on the record, I don't think it's the pure intent of the people. There's something else to this.
And he certainly has the money to fill that agenda. And there's something I want to say, what you just said a second ago, Doc, and that is about the testing, the rush, and the speed. They rushed it in 76 because they wanted a vaccine right away for the swine flu. They wanted it that year. And the result was Guillain-Barré and these thousands of people that were injured with something they didn't even know that could exist. But what you said about this being record time, I know this from looking at every other drug and the way it was. Before COVID, the doctors that I talked to who were vaccine doctors, infectious disease doctors, they would tell you 3, 4, 5 years, that would be a speed record. That's about as fast as it can get. Look at 2019, last year, we finally approved a vaccine for Ebola, 40 some odd years after it was discovered. There's still not one for HIV. These things take a long time, even when drug companies are looking for them. So if you really want to make sure that it's tested widely and that it has as much safety as possible, you don't want to actually see a vaccine in 12 to 18 months, because there is continued testing of it. There's continued human clinical trials. And guess what that is? That's the first wave of people who get the vaccine in real countries. Those people in the US and Italy and France and other places that line up and say, please let me get it because I'm at risk, I'm vulnerable, I'm afraid of COVID, they become part of the test pattern. And then all of a sudden you're able to sit back as a regulator or a health official and say, oh yeah, look at that. We inoculated 2.4 million people and we have a side effect developing with this or with that. Then they jump in with the numbers. But no one wants to be in that first group.
No, and what's essential for this, for people who are trying to understand this conversation, is that time is the variable that needs to play out. The reactions, adverse, severe, mild, in a week's timeline isn't enough. In a year's timeline, after they get the inoculation, again, that's the shot, not to be confused with what is known as an immunization. You're not immune to it. Those things you need years to see and track. And again, what could take 6 years to do, they're trying to do it now, according to the last media release, in 6 months. So before we bring this thing to a head, pal, I got to ask you, are there any other historical references or shots with these vaccinations and side effects people should know about in general? You mentioned some really good ones, but is there anything else that comes to mind?
I think the thing that's key to remember, and this shows up time and time again in the science as you go through the history of vaccinations, is that despite the testing, no matter how much they have tested, and they tested a lot, for instance, on polio, there's always something they find out once they get out into the field. In the field means they're actually doing the shots, and they're giving the vaccinations. They're extending it to millions of people. There's somebody who develops a syndrome, and they say, "Oh, that's just a one-off." Oh no, maybe it's more than a one-off. We have to look into it a little bit. And I'll tell you something, that it takes a while for the regulators to realize, and the science people to realize, whether something is just a symptom that's happening here and there and is spotting is coincidental, or whether it's a problem with the underlying vaccine. And that plays out every time to their surprise. And you just don't want to be part of the surprise of it to find out what it is down the road, because we don't know.
Right. And one question on this, and then I promise I'll bring this interview to a close, but I just, you're such a wealth of knowledge. In this book, Pharma, there are 300 pages of references. So this is an awfully thick book. A third of it is the references, the resources. These are scientific findings. This isn't Gerald Posner's opinion here. You mentioned the word syndrome, and immediately what comes to mind, and I'm always trying to find terms that people can relate to, or kind of put it in layman's terms that they go, "Oh, I think I'm familiar with that. I know more about it than I would have thought when you asked the question." What was Gulf War syndrome?
Yeah, so it's fantastic. Listen to this: Gulf War syndrome, exposure to all types of chemicals that we, the United States military, are using, as a matter of fact, throughout the Gulf War, just like the syndrome that came back from the Vietnam War from the use of napalm, which was a firebombing element that came back with soldiers who had lung and breathing problems, the equivalent of COVID for a decade to come. The very elements used in the process of war causes then physical symptoms that carry over and have to be treated by doctors and a new group of pharmaceutical products, even to the extent of not even Gulf War syndrome, but think of what today is an accepted element of fighters coming back from a war, and even first responders, PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. By the way, that, just as Gulf War syndrome, cannot be treated or paid for by insurance until it's a recognized medical illness. So what has to happen is pharma needs a collaborator. The collaborator is the oleopathic doctors, the doctors who make these diseases. So they need the psychiatric manual, the DSM in 1980, to call PTSD a disease. Then they can prescribe for it with antidepressants and mild tranquilizers, and you can have insurance covered. They need to have Gulf War syndrome actually medicalized so the Veterans Administration understands it's an illness, and then it can be paid for by insurance, and the drug companies can produce drugs for it. So there's a process in here in which we sometimes create the illnesses, and then we medicalize them, and then we treat them for big money.
Right. And with the U.S. veterans committing suicide at a rate of about 22 veterans per day, it's unfortunate. And I would say that they could definitely do a better job taking care of the people that gave us our freedoms. But that is the ultimate question, right? Freedom. Because what I see coming down the chute with COVID is what's known as mandatory medicine. So if I were to give you my recap in soundbite, we've got an inoculation, a vaccine that's being rushed at record speed, record time. So we are sacrificing safety in an effort for speed. And in the speed, they are also having this synonymous conversation that you will lose freedoms, a very important word to all of us. And the freedoms you might lose is if you don't get this mandatory, government-induced mandatory vaccine. Am I close on that?
Yeah, no, I think what will happen is it's going to become a weighing game. The weighing game is going to be individual liberties and freedoms versus the public health, the health of the community as a whole. So that's the hammer that will be used by public health officials in the government. They'll say, yes, you're entitled to individual freedoms, but you're not entitled to make somebody else sick. And therefore, you'll say, but I'm fine. I'm healthy. I just went and got a COVID test. I'm negative. Just went to get a serologic test, and I don't have any antibodies. I haven't been exposed. I'm okay. And they'll say, well, but maybe you'll be exposed tomorrow and you'll be an asymptomatic carrier. And you're going to go past someone who's working for the fire department or is working at a hospital, and they're going to be 55 years old, and you don't know they're pre-diabetes. You're going to infect them, and they're going to get really, really sick as a result of your selfishness. And not just because you're not standing 6 feet away and you're not wearing a mask, but let's make it easy for you and for them and everybody else. Just go down the street and get that shot of the new vaccine that was just put out. So that's going to be the way they're going to present it. And they're going to say to you, you're trying to say, I want to be free. But you're really saying is I want to be selfish. And therefore, we're telling you as the government, we know better than what you know.
Right. And there are so many people that I see this as a slippery slope where they're just saying, well, that must be it. They must know better than me. And they refuse to think for themselves. And I want to highlight these facts and go past this prologue. They have a history of rushing things, of profiting, of not being held accountable. And if there's no accountability, there's only the upside because the government absorbs the accountability. And that's all well and good if it's optional. But when we start talking about mandated medicine, I know on a continuum, you are then moving away from precision medicine, what people need on an as-need basis. We'll take a look at you, we'll make it specialized, and when it becomes mandated, it's a known fact there will be collateral damage of healthy people that will die in exchange for maybe protecting some of the older, sick, or weak people. And quite often, those people have lived the death style, not a lifestyle. And not everybody, but there are people that are living unhealthy lifestyles that are leaving themselves susceptible. And my advice to them from a wellness perspective would be, get yourself healthy. Your health is your responsibility. And unfortunately, when it comes to mandated medicine, I think that is a big issue with the speed and the lack of safety that we're seeing.
Well, I mean, from your perspective, you're a leading authority on wellness in your field. You understand that one of the best things to fight COVID is to be healthy, have your immune system strong. No question about that. Right. But a lot of people don't know what that means. They don't want to take the time to do it. It's too difficult for them to figure out. And here's the part where I think a vaccine will be sold, in essence, or marketed to the American public and other public in a way that will be very seductive for people to say no. We hear occasionally, there was a little bit of talk when they were talking about the serologic test, the antibody test. Would that test, if you turned out to have it, be a little bit of a passport that you'd be able to go back to work and say, look, I'm healthy, I've been exposed, and I don't have any. No, what's going to happen is the passport back to work, the passport back to a normal life, passport back to doing everything the way you remembered in February of 2020 and before will be getting the vaccine shot. Once you get the vaccine, then you'll get the little stamp on your passport that says, I can return to normal life. Now, even if that's not the case, that's the way to make sure that people line up for it. So you may not even need to mandate it in terms of knocking them on the head. You just need to hold the little bit of inducement out there to make sure they rush for it. That's the carrot I think that they may have.
Yeah, and oftentimes it's the carrot or the stick, and I think that's more stick than carrot because that's a form of bullying, right? They will bully you to get it and shame you if you don't, and how selfish of you. And I just say, selfish, show me the science. Show me the 10-year study that this is safe for the people you give it to. You show me the burden of proof needs to be on Big Pharma. And that's what people don't understand. The burden of proof traditionally in science is show me it's safe before we push it past my breathing, my natural immune defense systems, the things that my body does organically and naturally. When you mainline it into a vein, you skip the body's natural defenses for a respiratory illness. There's a bunch of natural built-in defense systems your body has when it's a breathing issue, and then you stick it into the vein. That's a big problem. So let me ask you, when they do this shot, is it going to be a one shot and you're done deal?
I'll be shocked if it's one shot and you're done. I would think that it's going to be a shot. As a matter of fact, GlaxoSmithKline and Johnson & Johnson have committed publicly, although they could change their mind. It's not sworn testimony, but they've at least made public statements that they will provide the vaccine at cost. Now, I'm not sure what that means. Let's hold on for a second. Why would they do that? Because they're a charity? Because they're out of the goodness of their heart? Because they've suddenly decided after 60 years of overcharging the public for every possible thing from talcum powder to Remicade that they're going to turn into saints? No. They're doing that because they believe that they will make an enormous profit on two other factors. The stockpiling that governments will do. So they'll have the first vaccine out, they'll give that out, they'll take it at cost, they'll take a hit. Then the government is going to start to stockpile in case COVID comes back in a variation of mutation. And then they also believe there will be booster shots in other years. So you're going to get the first one in, and then the booster shots will be where the money's made. So there, be careful. It's like heroin. They give you the first sample on the street free, and then you sort of like it. And the second and third and fourth time you go back, it's still free. And then the fifth time they suddenly want $10 for the patch. And after a month, you're robbing a local store so you can support your habit. So be careful of the cost vaccines from big companies.
Yeah, and big predatory pharma, as I like to call them, predatory pharma, that becomes in a business model, that's their loss leader, the first shot, and then the subsequent ones and the inoculations and the boosters that follow, they know where they're going to make their money. So the book is Pharma. The author is Gerald Posner. Phenomenal read, loaded with information, and I would just say, on a number of different fronts, this has been super insightful. And I want to wake some people up that just think, oh, it's no big deal. They're rushing this for our convenience. McDonald's is convenient too, and I'm against eating there. Call me crazy, but things that are sped up or quick or convenient are rarely healthy, and we see this time and again on a very serious level, more serious, with these inoculations. You mentioned Vietnam and some of the chemicals, things, even like, killing the plants with Agent Orange. Who made those chemicals back in Vietnam?
Oh yeah, no, it's fantastic. It's a chemical, industrial, pharmaceutical triangle here. There's no question about it. Monsanto, the big companies, the General Dynamics, they're involved here. There's the history of the pharma industry, as I show in my book. They grow out of the chemical business. They didn't stand all of a sudden and create themselves as drug companies. Right. So they were large chemical companies. And in Germany, where they started, they were just chemical companies. All of the early ones were. And the biggest pharmaceutical company in the history of the world, broken up after World War II, was IG Farben, which was Bayer and three other big German chemical companies, Hoechst and AGFA, that came together. So they grew out of chemicals. They found some therapeutic benefits in some of the alkaloids from the chemicals. That's when they started to then first have the process of offering them as medicinal purposes. And during the process of the next 50 or 60 years, they killed plenty of people as well as helping people along the way. So that's the birth of pharma, from chemicals. And that's their partnership still to this day.
As you know, buddy, I get a little, dyslexia from time to time. It kind of suits me when it does. And, Monsanto often gets confused in my head, and I call him Monsanton. I don't know. It just, they kind of jumble together. But that is also the company that made Roundup that they've been spraying at schools, and now they've got cancer cases with children, class action lawsuit. We can't make this stuff up. These are the same companies that show up time and again. And mandatory vaccines is known as mandatory medicine. And to me, that's when we start to lose our freedoms. And it's a real issue, and people just need to take a step back and look at this and say, if you have to have a mandatory vaccine to participate in life, we've completely lost our freedoms.
And one last thing, and this may not be for this, but I was watching today a piece on the BBC, a report about South Sudan, the part still under government control, where they've had some cases of COVID. And they obviously don't have any treatments, but what they're doing is they're fumigating and disinfecting. And you see people walking around with these sort of look like large hoses, and out is coming this white cloud of dust that's going over children, on clothes, and on everything. And I'm thinking to myself, this has to be a disinfectant or insecticide back in the day. Could you imagine the side effects from thinking that you can just disinfect a society by spraying everything in sight with some old style drum that's sitting around? What we're going to hear about down the road on the side effects from things like this that won't even be tied to COVID, right. That you might have cases of cancer or other things developing in the Sudan, for instance, from children exposed to this every day for the next 3 or 4 weeks. Nobody will think it was from COVID. They'll just think there's a cluster of high incidence of lung cancer or whatever. When you mentioned Roundup before, I don't know if it's Roundup, but I'm sure that I would not want to be in front of one of those sprayers in the Sudan.
Yeah, absolutely. We could do this for hours, but we're going to wrap this up. Anything I should have asked you, anything we should have mentioned on this particular topic?
No, I think you've got it. I mean, this is it. This is what it comes down to.
Yep. So inoculations, vaccinations are not the same thing as immunizations. Yes, buddy.
left out
But Trish has.
they're creating for the doctors and nurses PTS. They're going to, to be honest.
Oh yeah,
We've just started. We've started a whole new round. They're going to medicate them.
Yeah, one last thing. Sorry, Trish mentions one thing. It's interesting when we talk about creating diseases, medicalizing, and that today is an effort in the UK, and I'm sure it'll spread here soon. That the doctors and the nurses who have done a tremendous job at hospitals treating COVID patients may have a unique form of PTSD because of what they've been through, similar to what happens in a war, but a little bit different because they're not accustomed to going to 12-hour shifts and seeing 10 people die, as they have often in Italy and other places on ventilators. And so if that is carved out as a unique form of mental distress, I guarantee you, pharma will have a fix for that.
Right. Yeah, they create the problems and then they got something to profit on the solution. So again, you know, if
I think they take legitimate problems. I mean, there's no question. I don't mean to minimize the effect, the trauma of being on the front lines as a nurse or doctor in a hospital in COVID. What I think happens is they take legitimate problems and medicalize them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I look at things like opioids and oxy, and I think they make those problems, and then they also benefit. You know, there's profits around the board with them. I just think when it comes to mandatory medicine, especially with an inoculation, that's where we lose our freedoms. And I would also end it with this: if the vaccine does work and someone gets it, great, then you should be safe. Why would you need to mandate on everybody else? If your vaccine works, if your mask works, then why do we all need to get them for those of us that are skeptical or don't want to be the first ones to roll up our sleeves? So if your mandatory vaccine should work, we should all be exempt because, hey, it works. And I think it ends the conversation right there. So as always, buddy, I appreciate it. I would encourage everybody to get this book, not just because I love it and not just because Gerald's phenomenal with the information and on camera, but I would tell you where it's cited, the research, the references. It's important to know these are facts, not opinions. And what we're trying to do is prevent the past from being prologue, and we want to keep your family safe. Thanks again, Gerald Posner, for joining me, and let's do it again.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. It's great to always talk to you. You know, you're cursed with common sense and logic, and that is something that's not abundant in nowadays. So it's good to always hear what you have to say.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So that interview I thought was phenomenal. And for you to catch future interviews, just remember to hit the subscribe, and even better is click this little notification button, the bell, because then when these videos drop, you won't miss it. And our perspective on the Wellness Champions is to bring you health naturally. Maybe to present options you didn't know existed in a world where oftentimes it's controlled by the mass media. And this is why we love YouTube. We can bring you the truth. We can show you scientific articles that are presented that oftentimes aren't talked about on the mainstream. And if you really want to take a deeper dive and you have a company or a corporation that's interested in topics like this, just so you know, what the Wellness Champions do is we are a 501c3 that can bring doctors to your workplace. We can do virtual talks, what we call telemedicine health talks, and we can even do virtual talks in a webinar format for your employees. We are all about getting the message out there, the science and the research that validates the truth, so you can live a natural lifestyle and give you some guidelines as to how that works in steps and proactive measures to stay out of the sick care system. Hey, if you want to let us know, go over to our website, wellnesschampions.org, and we can find a doctor that can accommodate your schedule and a doctor that will help you out. So wellnesschampions.org can help you out. And as always, what a pleasure to interview Gerald Posner. Brilliant man, investigative journalist, and he spent the last 5 years bringing you that content on a hotly contested topic of vaccines. Now you know, follow us with notifications, and we'll bring you more information just like this in the future. Leave some comments if you're interested. We'd be happy to get a doctor to come to your workplace, or like I said, we could do it virtually as well, but drop some comments down below or head over to the website. We can gather some information from there. Cheers, everybody.